for those who are on the on the agenda as a presenter or participant speaker, there are name tags around the table here. We're just delighted to see all of you here this morning. We're going to have a really fascinating opening session, so I'm pleased that you all got out of bed early this morning and made it over here. But I'm Paul Peterson. I'm the director of the program on education policy and governance here at the Taubman Center on state and local government here at the Kennedy School. And our program's been in existence now for about 15 years, and we're very pleased to host on occasion events such as this, which bring people from around the United States and from around the world to talk about the ways in which we can move education forward. And specifically, we have held 3 conferences in the past 3 years, focusing on the countries that seem to be performing more successfully, where students are performing more successfully than elsewhere in the world. And that's been made possible by the collection of data by international organizations, and we have exploited that. In our first conference, we talked about which countries were the best at educating the most talented students in their country. The talented 10th, we called that, although the percentage varied a lot from one country to another. And last year, we talked about bringing students up to proficiency, and we looked at which countries did the best. This year, we did something that's really quite different from what has been done by others, and different from what we have done in the past. Those of us who have worked on this report, Ludger Wussmann at the University of Munich, who unfortunately can't be with us today, and Eric Hanushek, who is here at the head table and will talk about our latest report in more detail. In this latest report that we have just issued, which is really the springboard for our conversation over the next 2 days, we looked at which countries around the world and which states within the United States seem to be moving forward more rapidly than others. So it is not a look at which are the highest performing countries in the world. We don't just say, as has been pointed out many times, that Korea and Singapore and Finland and countries whose names we all recognize in this context are performing at a very high level. And of course that remains true. But we are looking at which countries over the last 15 years and which states over the last 20 years have made the most progress. And a lot of the people who are going to be talking over the next 2 days and making their presentations come from places which have been more successful than others, at least according to the data that we have been looking at. Latvia is one, and Chile and Brazil and Germany and Colombia and the United Kingdom and Ontario. Those are systems that are improving at a more rapid rate than others, we believe. It's going to be a great opportunity for me to hear from people who have lived and worked in these parts of the world. And within the United States, Maryland and Florida and Delaware, Massachusetts, South Carolina are among the states that are particularly more rapidly moving, and we're going to have folks from these places sharing their thoughts with us. We sort of have 2 ideas here at this conference. There's 2 kinds of knowledge. There's one kind of knowledge is direct experience, and there's a lot of people here with direct experience that can share what they know from their knowledge on the ground. And then there's another kind of knowledge out there, which is what the academics prefer, which is systematic comparisons among places. And academics like that because they have no experience, you know. So they don't believe much in this real experience business. Unless you really talk to them privately, then they'll admit it. But but from a professional point of view, they like to do systematic comparisons. Well, we're being agnostic at this conference. We believe we can learn from both kinds of information. So in that sense, this is going to be an unusual conference. We're going to have a combination of people who really look at what's happening in a systematic way, and others who are going to report on their experiences on the ground. And I think the complementary perspectives will be very helpful. Welcome again, and I want to thank a number of people who have been critical to arranging the possibility for this event. The most important being the Kern Family Foundation. We have two project officers, Jim Rao and Ryan Olson, who are with us today, and thank you for your support. I'm looking around to see you. You can hold up your hand. Oh, there you are, sitting in the back. So thank you very much, and thank you to the Kern Family and Family Foundation for their support. And I want to thank the staff of the Program on Education Policy and Governance. Antonio Wentland is never here when I'm, there he is. There's Antonio. And thank you very much, Antonio. You can try to catch Antonio if you have a question. Otherwise, you can talk with Amanda Olberg over here, who has also played a very important role. And thank you, Amanda, for your help, and Maura Roach and Ashley Inman as well. So we've had a lot of folks helping us, and I personally appreciate that. Now, today we're going to have the morning is going to end a little early, which is not the way I usually think conferences should go, but we need to have time for an early lunch so that we can gather back in this room at 12 noon to hear Governor Scott Walker talk about his experiences in Wisconsin and his vision for how we are going to go forward in Wisconsin. So we're very delighted to have that keynote address in the middle of the day. And but in order to make all that work right, we're going to have one long session this morning and then a break when we can have lunch just before the governor's address. Now, we do have some rules of the game. There is cheating at conferences. You know, there's been allegations of cheating in education and cheating on tests even. And we're going to be talking a lot about tests, I'm sure. And one of the criticisms is cheating. And so we don't want cheating. And cheating at conferences is stealing time from other presenters than from your audience as a whole who have things they want to share. And so we have a police officer here. Amanda, do you want to stand up? We just want everybody to know who the police officer is. That's going to keep things on track. So, this morning we have a very strong chair of the morning session. My good friend Ed Glaeser, who is the director of the Taubman Center on State and Local Government here at the Kennedy School, is also a professor of economics in the Department of Economics here at Harvard University, one of the greatest, perhaps the leading urban economist in the world, and it's just a great pleasure for me personally to have Ed's support for the work that we do and for his willingness to join us this morning and to provide the direction to our opening session. So at this point, without further ado and right on schedule, we're going to turn it over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah. The job of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government at Harvard's Kennedy School is to remind Kennedy School students that not everything that government does happens in Washington, D.C., and not everything that is good in the world goes on in the United Nations or in the corridors of power outside our state capitals. But indeed, many of the most important, most critical things that are done by government are done by state and local governments, whether it is the safety of our streets or the schools that our children go to. These are the province of state and local government, and that is why we are so proud to host Paul Peterson in the program on education policy and governance. Paul has over 15 years done extraordinary things for education research, and this program is just a wonderful part of Harvard and of the school. I'm particularly grateful that this wonderful new report that Paul and Ludwig Grossman and Rick brought out actually focus on state-level heterogeneity as well, because it continues to be incredibly important to understand which states are doing better and less well, and why they are doing so. And I hope we do have a chance to get into that today. I'm sure we will. But I'm very, very grateful to be here and to be with all of you. I know share my view that human capital, skills, education is the bedrock on which the success of cities, states, and nations rest. Now, we have a fantastic panel to start us off today. I think we're going in order across, which means that Rick Hanushek is going to be first. Rick is really, I don't know, the dean of education economists. While there has been a flurry in the past decade of economists working on education, when I first started in this business more than 20 years ago, Rick was sort of almost a voice in the wilderness on this. I mean, he was really the first major economist who was working on this stuff in the early days, or one of the first. And the list of things that he has contributed to our knowledge about how schools work, how just throwing money at the problem alone doesn't matter, how important teachers are to academic success is really extraordinary. He is, of course, a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. Next to him is Sir Michael Barber, who is currently the Chief Education Advisor at Pearson. Before that, he's been a partner at McKinsey, and I think he's also been head of the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit for the United Kingdom and Chief Advisor to the Secretary of State for Education on school standards. Next to him is Andreas Schleicher, whose formal title is Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Secretary General, and head of the Indicators and Analysis Division. What you need to know is PISA. PISA, right? We all depend critically on these international tests for giving us a sense about how our school systems are doing in international comparison, and Andreas Schleicher has played as much of a role in making PISA function and work as anyone else. John Schnur is actually not here because he was my college classmate, although he was. But he is in fact here because he is the executive chairman and co-founder of America Achieves and chairman of the board and co-founder of New Leaders for New Schools. He has played a major role in education policy for almost 20 years since he has served as an education policy advisor to the Clinton administration. He played as much of a role as anyone in advising the current administration on education policy, both during the campaign and during the early years. And if you believe, as I'm sure many people do here, that the best thing this administration has done is raise to the top, well, then John is the person to give some credit to that for, or if you don't, then you can blame him. But in any case, thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for the panel for being here, and I hand it over to you, Rick.
Thank you, Ed. My role here is to make it easy for you to understand what's in this thick report. There are different versions of this. There's a 45-page green pamphlet that you have. There's a 8-page version from Education Next, and I'm the sweet voice that gives you all of the information you need here. The key questions that we look at in this report are fairly straightforward. Is U.S. achievement improving? Is the U.S. catching up with other countries? And are there important differences among the states, coming back to what Ed had said before? Now, many talks that are given are in the order of a mystery novel. I don't believe in that. Here's the answers. Yes, achievement is improving. No, the U.S. is not catching up with other countries in terms of achievement. And yes, there are huge differences among the states. And so I'll try to fill in the answers as we go along here. Now, the background for this is a series of discussions at the national level in the U.S., largely by presidents, that say we need to do something. It starts perhaps before A Nation at Risk, it probably starts with the launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union, when we started our dialogue on education and thought that education was part of the national interest to improve our schools. Nation at Risk said we're in trouble. President George Bush I convened all of the governors in a historic meeting in 1989 in Williamsburg, Virginia, in which they claimed that the U.S. should become first in the world in math and science by the year 2000. President Clinton reiterated that by setting Goals 2000, which said, let's do it. President Bush II, coming in after the year 2000, when we were nowhere near being first in the world in math and science, instituted No Child Left Behind, which said every student in the U.S. should be proficient by 2013. Luckily, this conference is in 2012. And President Obama has made a number of statements that basically say we've got to do something if we're going to maintain our economic position. Perhaps the most recent is a statement by my colleague Condoleezza Rice as part of the Council on Foreign Relations publication that returned to basically the Sputnik view of the world, and that is it's a matter of national defense and security that we improve our education system. So that's the background for where we are, and what we want to talk about today is, are we on any of these paths that have been set out for us over the last 40 or so years, and where are we? So what we're going to do here is take some of the readily available information. We're going to start with NAEP, the National Assessment for Educational Progress in the U.S. We're going to add in PISA. Andreas Schleicher would like us to stop here, but we're going to go on to add in TIMS and PEARLS on reading and try to use all of the information we have to see both where the U.S. stands in terms of performance and the growth in performance, and then to take it down to the state level and talk about which states are doing well and which aren't. Now, what we're going to do is combine all the tests. We have a big machine that makes sausage, and we're going to show you the fully encased sausage in a minute, but just believe us that there's this machine in the background that builds upon NAEP performance over time and uses that to calibrate all of the international tests and calibrate to the states. The thing to remember is we're going to place growth in performance in terms of percents of standard deviations. This is satisfying Paul Peterson's view that economists and academics like to talk about these technical things. But the thing to remember in the background to normalize all this is, if you look at NAEP performance at least, one standard deviation of test scores is roughly 4 years of performance. And so a quarter of a standard deviation is 1 year of performance. Now, we're actually doing two different analyses in this report that we're combining together. The first is an international analysis which builds upon the combination of all the PISA, TIMS, Trends in International Math and Science Studies, and PEARLS, something about reading. I forget the program, International Reading, somehow that fits. From 1995 to 2009, we have 49 countries that we can track over time with enough time to give us some idea of the trajectory that countries are on. There are 28 separate tests by subject, country, year, and grade level, essentially, all between ages 9 and 15 that we're going to combine. The second analysis goes to NAEP and compares states. And what we use there are the state level NAEP that began in 1992, and we have all the performance on NAEP from 1992 to 2011. We have it for 41 states because 9 states did not participate in the original NAEP in 1992, and some held out till 2003 before they would participate in NAEP when they were required to. But we're going to concentrate on the 41 that we can track. And so let me give you the findings quickly of what we're going to do. This is filling in question number 1. If we look at U.S. annual gains, we calibrate everything to the NAEP performance of 4th and 8th-year-olds, and it says that we are improving at 1.6% of a standard deviation per year, which amounts to 22% of a standard deviation over this time period that we look at, which corresponds to about a year of achievement, of learning, according to the NAEP. So that's the optimistic, rosy side of it. But the other side of this is that's the median level of performance around the world. Of the 49 countries we have, 24 do better than we do, and 24 do worse than we do. So that growth has not, in fact, changed our position much, and it will not in the future at that rate. Now there's a series of pictures in the Green Book that you might get into over time. This ranks all the countries. The green bar at the bottom is the United States growth, and this is in annual gains on the international test. And all the countries are rank ordered. The red line is where the U.S. average is. So everybody on the top is doing better than the U.S., and everybody on the bottom is doing worse. So you have the countries that Paul mentioned before. I'll come back to them at the top. And then at the bottom, you have a group of countries that includes Sweden and Thailand and others. Here are the winners in the sense of improving the most between 1995 and 2009, according to all of the international math, science, and reading tests combined. So Latvia is on top at 4.7% of a standard deviation per year, and you have this country of Latvia, Chile, Brazil, and the UK is at 2.8%. Now, I'll stop for a second and just throw out the question. Maybe if this paints too rosy of a picture, by the way, of this growth, because what we've done is calibrate everything to the growth in 4th and 8th grade NAEP, and that's where we get the 1.6 standard deviations that I mentioned. If we used 8th grade NAEP on the argument that the 4th grade NAEP doesn't tell us much if it doesn't translate into 8th grade NAEP, it looks like we've increased at 1% per year. Or if you use the PISA standardization, which is psychometrically aligned over time, you get 0.5% of a standard deviation per year. But even that may overstate reality, and I'm just throwing this out as a question to be handled later in the discussion. If we look at the NAEP scores for 17-year-olds, the answer is 0. Now, we don't look at that at the 17-year-old performance, which has been flat since 1970 till the current time. We don't look at the 17-year-old performance because we can't do that for individual states. But bear in mind that the increases that we've seen in the 4th and 8th grade have yet to translate into performance at the time when people are going to college or going out into the job market. So let's look at the states now. I have a picture here that everybody can find your favorite state if you got to the level 3 on the geography test. The black states are the ones that did not participate in the NAEP in 1992 and are not included in our study. The brighter the color, the better the states have done. So the bright green that are in the south sweeping up a little bit on the east coast are the states that have done the best. And then they go down to the lightest dotted states that are doing the worst. When Governor Walker comes, you might notice that he has a challenge in front of him because Wisconsin is one of the states in the dotted part of poor performance of growth between 1992 and 2011. So the winners, happy to have Nancy Grafnick here, representing the winner at the gold medal in Olympic fashion, is 3.3% of a standard deviation per year. Florida follows closely behind at 3.2%, and Delaware at 3.2%. Because we're in Massachusetts and Dave Driscoll is here, we have to note that fourth place, almost winning in this competition, is Massachusetts. We have the top performers are improving at a little over 3% of a standard deviation per year. How does that compare? Well, remember the graph I had before. Those states would fit into the top 10 internationally. And in fact, if you look at this list, there are only 2 countries on there that start out ahead of us. Hong Kong, still counting them as a country, and Germany would be improving faster than us and are ahead of us. But everybody else there is behind us, and this would, if we were improving at the rate of the top states, we would in fact be moving toward the top of the international rankings. But we aren't, because there are states like Iowa and Wisconsin and Nebraska that are dragging us down. Here's who is at the bottom of the rankings. You start at the bottom at Iowa, which was #1 in the nation in NAEP in 1992, has, in their complacency, been the slowest improver in performance and has dropped to 22nd, Paul? Yes. 22nd in 2011 because of the complacency that we're doing fine, thank you. But we have Maine, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Nebraska that, in fact, fill out the bottom end of the spectrum. Here's some other states. We tried to get big states because we figured that most of the people in this room were from big states by random selection. And so here's where other people stand in terms of growth. New Jersey comes in fairly close. New York, Colorado, and Texas, not so good. Okay, so recently there's been a lot of discussion about whether NCLB in particular has skewed all of the attention to the bottom of the distribution, so that if you are gaining a lot, you've done it by, in fact, working on the bottom end of the distribution. What we have here is a simple plot of the states in terms of growth in performance. Along the horizontal axis is movement at the top of the NAEP distribution. Along the vertical axis is movement at the bottom. And what you see is that states that are doing well do well at both ends of the distribution. They improve, with a few exceptions that are outliers. States that have high average growth do it by both improving at the bottom end and improving at the top end. States that do badly don't do anything, right? At either the top or bottom end. So it has not been the historical case that we've just traded off performance at the bottom end for everybody else. Now, if you look at the picture, there are a lot of states in the South. In fact, no state in the South is in the bottom of the distribution, and none in the South has 5 of the top 10 growers. So one argument is that the South has paid more attention to their standing, or the alternative is that they just started behind and have found it easier to catch up. And there's some evidence that, in fact, the states that start out lowest on NAEP along the horizontal axis and the growth rate is on the vertical axis, the ones who have started out behind have in fact improved more. This is not the case, by the way, internationally. We listed Latvia, Chile, and Brazil as the most rapid growers, but internationally there's no relationship between where countries start and where they end up. It's not just the ones that are behind that do better. But in the States, it is the case that the ones that have started out behind have, either through finding it easier to improve from their starting place or having more pressure to improve, have done so. But here's the standard explanation, of course. When you're from California, you know that all of California's problems come from a budget problem and shortage of money for school. Well, here is the change in expenditures per student over the period 1990 to 2010 compared to, that's on the horizontal axis, the real increase in spending per student, and on the vertical axis is the growth rate. And what you see is that there's just no relationship between putting more money into the schools and the outcomes that you get in terms of growth. Some states spend a lot and get a lot of growth out of it. Some states spend a lot and get nothing out of it. And on the other end, some states don't spend very much and get a lot of growth over time, and others don't. So that it's, again, back to the standard answer that how you spend money is much more important than how much you spend. That's what we're seeing again and again. Finally, let me come back to the original motivation for this. Ludger Wussmann and I have been doing a lot of work on the implications of performance on international math and science tests and the economic performance of nations. What we've found is that countries that do better on skills, on math and science skills, grow faster. And the implications are huge when you work it out. I was telling Michael Filane that if we could only be Canada, which seems kind of feasible, I mean, we might even annex them, on average. But if we could only be Canada, the calculations from the historic growth rates are that the present value of that to the U.S. is on the order of $45 trillion. And we have a $15 trillion economy, our total GDP. So it's 3 times our current GDP if we could only be Canada. But one of the implications of that is, and people ask us this all the time, can you really believe that there's a causal relationship? Is it the fact that other things are going on and people, countries where the achievement is high have other advantages economically? So one of the implications that we've looked at is if a country has increased its performance over time, of which a number have, as we've been showing you, does their growth rate also improve? Now, it's an improvement in the growth rate that we're looking at. This is a simple plot for the countries that we can look at this over time. And what you find is the trend in test scores along the horizontal axis and the trend in growth rates along the vertical axis. You find that it does pay off by all history. The answers again, no mystery here. We have been improving, although there are some caveats of how you measure that, how you normalize that. The U.S. has not been catching up internationally, and there are huge differences in the U.S. such that we don't have to be Finland to, in fact, have reasonable schools. We could be Maryland, or Massachusetts even would do fine for us. And these are examples that seem within reach if we could in fact improve our schools in that way. So let me end by my picture of U.S. Educational policy and discussions. We start with a broad recognition of the value of education. And that has led to, in most cases, a recognition that we have to improve. Not everybody agrees with that, but most people agree that we ought to improve our schools. That leads, as we saw early in the talk, to a set of challenging goals, first in the world in 2000, et cetera. And that has always led to failure. And this is so that then puts us on a path. We come back to, well, education is important. And we somehow have to break that cycle if, in fact, we are going to see the economic future and the social future that we hope for in the future.
Thank you, Rick. As always, fascinating and incredibly important work. I'm so glad you decided to reopen the War of 1812 again, also especially with Sir Michael Barber being our next presenter.
It's the only historical date that students can get right now.
No 1453? No 44 BC? There's a musical. That's something.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I just want to check with the police officer that the time spent looking at the computer doesn't count towards my allotted 20 minutes. Look, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a great honour to be at this event with such a distinguished range of academic and practitioner people in the whole field of whole system reform and school reform. It's a bit daunting to look around and see Nancy Grasmick and David Driscoll and Michael Fullen and Jerzy Wisniewski, all of whom have played a leading part in different parts of the world in significant school reforms. I'm going to make a few, 5 or 6 observations about the state of international comparisons and what we can learn from them and where I think that field is developing. As mentioned in the introduction, I played a key part back in the early part of the last decade and the end of the 90s in the school reform in England in particular. And I was glad to see the UK just scrape into Eric's top 10 there on improvement. If you want more detail, there's a very good paper in the pack by Steve Machin, who's here, looking at the comparison of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and the different periods when those systems improved or indeed didn't improve. I was pleased to see incidentally that the rate of improvement was fastest in England during my 4 years in the Department of Education. I think that's a coincidence, but anyway, I was delighted to see it. It's a wonderful time in global education, actually, because there is recognition that education is absolutely fundamental, or human capital is absolutely fundamental to the future of the global economy. Wherever you go in the world, that's the case. It's a wonderful time because, as a result of the work of Andreas and others, Eric, many distinguished people, we actually have a set of benchmarks that we didn't have 15 years ago. And the benchmarks enable us to do rank ordering, and they enable us to look at other countries and see which ones are winning and losing, which ones are moving fastest, as we've just heard. And indeed, within countries, Canada, Australia, and now the US are really doing these in-country comparisons of states, all very, very important stuff. So we know it's important, as Eric was saying at the end. We know who's doing well and who's doing less well. We know who's improving fastest and who's improving least fast. But the most important thing is, out of those benchmarks, we can really learn at a level of detail what works. So we're beginning to build a knowledge base that simply didn't exist 15 years ago on what works. Sometimes you read, sometimes it's in the media, but sometimes it's among people involved in education reform who should know better. You read very, very simplistic comparisons that Finland are top, let's be like Finland, without recognizing the huge cultural and other challenges involved in being like Finland or being like Hong Kong or being like any single place. The real power is in the comparison at the level of detail. What exactly do they teach in maths in Singapore to a 15-year-old? That kind of question. Or how exactly do they recruit teachers, and what is the content of the teacher preparation program? Or how in Ontario do they do collective capacity within a school and between schools? These are the areas where the learning comes from the benchmarking, and the evidence base is so much more powerful than before. So we know it's important. We've got the benchmarking. We know a lot about what to do. The real challenge is doing it, getting it done. We don't want to be globally or in any given country or any given state like that Russian Prime Minister who retired in 1996 and said, we tried to do better, but everything turned out as usual. But when you look around the world, that is in fact what's happening in many countries. Many countries are plateauing out or even declining. You look at India, for example, big growth in expenditure, big growth in enrollment, falling performance over the last 4 or 5 years. So lots of countries, even though we have the knowledge that it's important, the benchmarking and the knowledge, a lot of knowledge anyway, about what needs to be done, a lot of countries aren't actually doing it. So I want to try and address those themes in the next few minutes. And then feel free to ask any questions. And if you want to know more about England or the UK, you can ask me, and if they're really difficult, I'll pass them to Steve here in the front row. So look, first thing I want to say is, if you look at the international comparisons over the last 10 or 15 years, what you see is a development in the way the international benchmarking debate is going. So back in the late 1990s, or even the early part of the last decade, when these international comparisons came out, Education at a Glance from the OECD, or TIMSS, or PISA from 2001, generally what happened, and I speak for ourselves in England, is we looked to see where we were in the rank ordering, and if we were high up, we tried to get a lot of media coverage, and if we were low down, we tried to avoid media coverage, and the result was in fact the exact opposite. The lower we were, the more media coverage we got, and then we forgot about it until the next round. And then something very significant happened when the first round of PISA came out, and Andreas played a key part in obviously getting it to that stage. But Germany discovered it was very low in the rankings relative to what it expected. It was around 20th, depending on which subject you look at. And there was a huge kind of psychological crisis. And the Germans are very good at psychological crisis. And the front page of the Spiegel magazine was, "Are our children stupid?" I'm serious, but they looked at that. They got a group of academics from around the world, including my good friend from Oxford, Pam Salmons, to be part of a panel to look at what they should do. And then they took that seriously, and you see they're now moving up. It took a decade, but they're moving up. So that was the second. So the first response was, let's manage the media. The second response was, let's learn spasmodically from each round when they come out. And now we're in the third phase, and this conference is a good example of it, but there are many around the world, which is why Andreas is always on a plane, where ministers are gathering to learn systematically. So we're in a phase now of continuous international learning, and Arnie Duncan, with Maureen's help, has played a big part in this, getting together systems to discuss teacher policy, to try and arrive at a kind of consensus on what the international comparisons show about how you should develop your teaching profession. So we're in a very, very interesting phase. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The next thing is, I mentioned that we are beginning to know what works. I want to try and summarize that. There are various reports that you can read on this. I was involved in 2 at McKinsey, one on how the top performing systems come out on top, and then the second one on how the most improved systems keep getting better. But there are others. There's the work that Mark Tucker, Bob Schwartz, and others did with Andreas for the OECD. The book's called Surpassing Shanghai, and there's an OECD report which summarizes largely the same content. All of it is actually pointing largely in the same direction, and there are some very clear things coming through. One is setting standards that are comparable with the best in the world. So if you say in your system to a 15-year-old, you're good at maths, that should mean you'd be good at maths if you're in Singapore or Hong Kong, as well as if you're in Maryland or London or wherever it might be. So setting internationally benchmarked standards, and that's why I think in the US the Common Core is a huge opportunity. If you look at the current state of affairs, although the UK made it onto Eric's chart, in reading age 15 in PISA, students in England are 10 months behind students in Singapore, even though students in Singapore are learning English as a second language. So we've got a long way to go. We may have made it onto the improvement chart, but we're nowhere near world class. So the setting of international standards is a key lesson. Getting good data into your system is a key lesson. There's a debate, and there's no clear answer on this, on how much of the data you put out, how much you use it in rank ordering and league tables, and how much you you simply use it as a kind of transparency within the system. But having good data, checking what's happening, looking at the impact of individual teachers, individual schools on different students, different groups of students, getting the good data and really analysing it and applying it into decision making is fundamentally important. A third key lesson is making sure that every student is on the agenda. Too many systems kind of teach a group of students and hope they'll get better, and some of them keep falling off the bottom all the time. And so when you get to age 15 or 18, a lot of students have fallen by the wayside. So making sure every student's on the agenda, picking them up when they fall behind their peers, and making sure they catch up is absolutely vital. Finland is fantastic at this, but so are many of the Pacific Asian countries. And then there's a whole set of lessons that come through in the McKinsey report about attracting great people into teaching, people with the right personal skills, people with the right motivation, but also people with the right talent, knowledge, and so on, and then training them really well. And then crucially, and this is a key point in Michael Fullin's work, making sure that once they start teaching, they keep getting better year after year, because they're part of an institution that expects that. They're part of a collective capacity within the school and within a district and within a system. And if you can get that going, you get continuous improvement. If you look at the US data on that, what you see is that certainly in the past, data from about 10 years ago, teachers improved for the first 3 years they were teaching and then plateaued for 37 years and then retired. That is not a very attractive career. And so getting that continuous improvement is a kind of fundamental part of this. And then there's the whole question of great leadership at school level, district level, and obviously system level. So I'm summarizing a lot of data. Those are all practical, doable things that if countries take them seriously, they can put in place and make a difference, that they'll see the difference within 2 to 3 years, and if they keep doing it, they'll keep the improvement going. The challenge, as ever, is having an implementation approach that actually works. But there are some real challenges about implementation. One is getting the political alignment. Most countries around the world, and it's a blessing, are democracies, but democracies have elections and throw up all kinds of weird and wonderful people to win elections. That's why we like democracy. But it means in those circumstances, getting continuity is a real challenge. I was talking with Terry Peterson last night about South Carolina back in the 80s and 90s, and Governor Riley, as he then was, managing to make some reforms as a Democrat, but also secure them so that they continued through the Republican administration that followed. So in democracies, getting that political continuity is a real challenge. There's some continuity actually in the reforms in England between, for example, the Blair administration that I was part of and the current Conservative Liberal coalition. And Michael Gove, the current Secretary of State, refers back to that era as the inspiration for what he's doing. But getting that political continuity is a challenge, and getting the political alignment at any given moment is a challenge as well. Have you got the right Secretary of Education with the right degree of courage, the right backing from the Prime Minister or President, and so on, and then the relationships out with the various local or state parts of the system. So political alignment is a challenge to doing the right thing. And then there's the sheer strength of the status quo, which has been built in a different system, and changing the status quo, moving the different parts of the institutional architecture that were built for the previous system and now need to be reformed. That needs courage, it needs sustained implementation, and some systems really struggle with that, either through lack of political courage or simply because it is actually bureaucratically very difficult. And in the end, it's a battle between the future system and the past system for public opinion and public support. And if you can't win that argument, it becomes very difficult to shift the system forward. So the strength of the status quo is a really challenging thing to think through. And too often, school systems, the government and whoever's defending the status quo get into a kind of slanging match, forgetting that the public who pay their taxes to run this system are actually the people who are the payers for this system, and they fail to communicate effectively to them. And so the people in the public are saying a plague on both their houses rather than getting a kind of clear sense of the direction. And you have to remember all the time that while probably we in this room are talking about what an education system should be like in 20 years' time, the parents are remembering a system they were in 20 years ago. So there's a kind of 40-year communication gap that you have to overcome. And then there's simply learning how to do implementation, which is a lot of what I've been writing about in the last 5 or 10 years. And there are better and worse ways of doing implementation. If I take two really good examples from the last 10 years of education reform, The Dalton McGuinty reforms in Ontario that Michael Fullan's been involved in are a model of using capacity building, using goals, using transparency, using sustained reform, taking all the distractions off the table and keeping focused on the performance goals as a model of how to do a reform. Take a totally different reform, totally different part of the world. You look at the way the Hong Kong system has set out its new curriculum, its new agenda, the changes it wants to make, and then implemented them slowly but steadily over 10 to 12 years. And now that whole curriculum and assessment program, very radically redrawn, is coming into place in every school in Hong Kong in a really systematic way. So there are different models of implementation, but some of them are really good. Those are two excellent examples, and some of them really don't work. We need to learn collectively about the implementation as well as about the lessons from the benchmarking. And then if I come to the final couple of points I want to make, I just want to look ahead at what's coming on the international agenda. So far, as a result of Andreas's work, the people who run TIMS and so on, we know a lot from comparisons of math, science, and the national language. And that is very useful. Those things are good indicators of many other educational outcomes, so they're valid beyond the simple subjects that we're talking about. In PISA in particular, we begin to get into the application of the knowledge to particular real-life problems. So you get into some aspects of how students think, and that's powerful, important. But let's look ahead. On Andreas's agenda is the introduction in 2015 PISA of testing collaborative problem solving. That's a major step forward, but it's also a major conceptual challenge how to do that across 60 or 70 or 80 countries. So that's being worked on, but it's very, very important. And whether you use the phrase 21st century skills or not, getting into not just knowledge, but how children learn to think and different kinds of thinking, how they learn to collaborate and different kinds of collaboration, how they learn to lead and be influential in different circumstances. These are all key aspects of preparing students for the 21st century. Collaborative problem solving in PISA is one step towards that, but there's a whole debate to be had among us about how you test those other crucial learning outcomes, not as an alternative to English, maths and science, but as well as English, maths and science. So I think there's an agenda there for the researchers in the room, for the policy leaders in the room, and for us to debate with the public. Then there's another aspect of this future that I think will rise significantly. One is, which is how to match education system reform with choice, alternative providers and so on, which is obviously a huge debate here. The current administration and previous ones have promoted charter schools, have looked at various alternatives, encouraged choice. But how that works in a whole system, I think will turn out to be one of the policy dilemmas that we need to resolve. Personally, I believe that if you can combine the kind of Ontario whole system reform approach with choice, with options for parents who very often want that, not necessarily for educational outcome reasons, but because they think choice itself is intrinsically beneficial, we can get real power into this movement. But that's not an evidence-based view. It's I think it's an emerging view, but it's not yet confirmed. But that will be a key part of the debate as we go forward. Then there's a third part of this, which is the whole technology revolution that people have been predicting is about to happen for most of the last 30 years. But I'm going to predict that it really is about to happen now. One indication of whether something is about to happen is whether Michael Fullan has recently published a book about it. And he's just published a fantastic book called Stratosphere, which the basic argument, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, says think about whole system reform, think about pedagogy, and then think about technology as part of a kind of triangle that pulls all that together. And what's really important about that is that's a book about how technology is going to transform education, written by somebody who isn't a technology enthusiast. He comes at it from a whole system reform perspective. I think that will be the key. But I think we will see big changes. And again, you can see that emerging in some parts of the world. And I think actually in this area, the US has a lot to say, a lot to show the rest of the world. Talking to Arnie Duncan recently, he was saying the US still has pockets of excellence, pockets of innovation that are showcases for the rest of the world. So there's something there that people need to be watching in this country. And the combination of the things I've just talked about, 21st century skills, choice and alternative providers, and combinations of education reform and technology, these things are going to show us the way to the future. So if I summarize that, there's a kind of, you could do it as an equation: whole system reform plus systemic innovation equals the whole system revolution. And that's what I think we will see if we get all these things right in the next 5 to 10 years. Myself and 2 colleagues here, Caitlin Donnelly and Saad Rizvi, are publishing in about 3 weeks a pamphlet called Oceans of Innovation that takes this argument through. It's particularly addressing Pacific Asian systems, but the lessons are generalizable, and we'll distribute it to the people in the room now when that comes out. So summarizing, it's a great time in global education because we know it's important. We know a lot about what to do. We've got the data to keep monitoring what's working and what isn't. The big challenge is actually getting it done, overcoming those barriers, keeping learning from the international comparisons, and then beginning to anticipate the way this debate will unfold in the future in the way that I've tried to do. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, and thank you for reminding me to remind my wife to make my kids do their Singapore math homework for the day. Our next speaker is Andreas Schleicher.
Thanks very much. I really find this report fascinating, and it provides a lot of sort of rich analysis on performance growth. I have just 3 sort of actually quite minor concerns with this kind of analysis. The first relates to Rick's sausage machine. I think you need to really make fairly strong assumptions when you patch together different data sets that are not on a common scale, and that approach is easy to justify when you compare sort of aggregate performance against aggregate social and economic outcomes. It becomes more difficult, more problematic when you actually look at score comparisons and growth measures. That's why the OECD our technical advisors oblige us to stick to one metric, and I've used the PISA metric in my comments. It's a choice, and the price for what we do is obviously a much more narrow perspective. I think what you have achieved is a much broader kind of approach looking at different sets. But I think this is an issue. My second comment is of a methodological nature too. I find the analysis on changes in distributions really interesting. But you can look at changes in distributions. It's always a question whether this is good or bad. I think there is no reason to expect every student to be equally good at every subject at any point of time. I think the more relevant question really is to what extent education systems succeed in making success independent of social background. That's the metric to optimize, that student success does no longer depend on their family income, even if they achieve different results. So narrowing the gap in itself, you can question that. And in our analysis, we put more emphasis on the dependency of success on social factors. Here I've just shown you from our PISA metric where countries stand in terms of quality, learning outcomes on the vertical axis, and equity measured in terms of success, the dependence of success on social background on the horizontal axis. And you can see countries are widely distributed on both dimensions. There are just huge performance gaps. And I wanted to add another dimension. Rick has done that too. And that has to do with money. This chart shows you the size of the dot, shows you spending per student for each country. And if money would tell you everything about the quality of an education system, you would find all the large bubbles at the top and all the small bubbles at the bottom. And that's not what you see. And I think, as Rick already pointed out, we find that money only explains about 18% of performance variation at best. And you can see, for example, Luxembourg, the most expensive system, isn't doing particularly well on that metric. So I think that's a very, very important consideration. And as Rick has mentioned, how you spend your money is a very important factor in this equation. We've actually looked at this in our analysis very closely. The first question you need to ask yourself is how much money actually arrives in the classroom. Now, there's a lot of money spent on education, but what actually is instructional spending? I've mapped that here on this chart relative to spending capacity. And you can see, for example, the United States is the second most expensive system, but comes actually quite out at the bottom when you look at the share of resources actually spent on instructional spending. Now, this is still not answering Rick's question, how do countries spend their money? If you look at this, it's really interesting. One way you can spend your money is by paying your teachers well, and you can see, for example, a country like Korea puts a lot of emphasis on attracting highly qualified people into the teaching profession. Sort of salaries relative to GDP are very high. Korea does another thing. They put a lot of volume of learning to students. Student learning time is very, very high. That's actually, by the way, a factor that relates positively to achievement growth and achievement only at the national level. Once you hold things constant, when you look at this in a cross-country perspective, volume of learning time is not a very good explainer of learning outcomes. Korea does yet another thing. They put a lot of money into basically offering teachers to do possibilities to do other things than teaching. Professional collaboration, lesson preparation, and so on. It adds to the spending as well. And now you ask yourself, how do the Koreans actually afford it? And the answer is they have very large classes. They make a choice between prioritizing the quality of teaching over the size of classes. You go to the next country on the list, Luxembourg, and you can see parents and teachers all like small classes. That's what's putting sort of pressure on spending. And you can actually look at this also in a growth perspective. Some countries have done adding a lot of money into reducing classes. Probably the most common trend in the industrialized world over the last 10 years since we do have PISA. That's been the most popular things to do. Everybody likes you if you make classes smaller. But even Luxembourg can spend its money only once. And the price for this has been little instruction time, lower salaries, little opportunities for teachers to do anything else than teaching. Now, this is a comparison at the high end of spending. You can see the same thing at the low end. You compare Finland and the United States. Countries that sort of come out fairly similarly on overall spending levels. But again, Finland is a lot more similar to Korea, despite being a very different culture. And the United States is a lot more similar to Luxembourg. And when you do this analysis on a more systematic way, you can actually find that this is a quite common pattern explaining performance differences. But again, we are talking about growth here, so I want to go back to the year 2000. This is how the world looked then in terms of sort of performance and spending per student. The first thing you saw when the switch happened, that we spent a lot less on education in the year 2000 than today. Growth in spending per student has been about sort of 40%. Countries have been very generous in funding education. But the question you can ask yourself is, if we spend so much more, has education become so much better? And the answer is the number of countries in which this has happened, and our analysis actually comes to very similar conclusions than Rick's, is not in too many countries. I want to just show you a few ones. Korea, the red dot right in the right corner. Korea did really well in the year 2000. But Korean educators and policymakers were not happy with those results. What did they criticize? They said, well, we are good average performers, but we have a very small elite. We have very few top scoring students, and that's what we want to have because those people are critical for economic success. So they put a lot of emphasis on this. In 9 years, they were able to double the share of top performing students in their country. You can see that here. They moved upwards like that. If you only focus on your best students, of course, you lose out on equity, and you could see that dot also moving slightly leftwards. That's the bad news for the Koreans. But overall, they're very successful. Chile, you wouldn't have found on the map in the year 2000 and 2009, improving by almost one school year. Poland, very impressive performance. You can see rising in performance and moving to the right side, improving equity. Poland actually is a good example of a system that has focused very much at the bottom end of the distribution, halved the proportion of poorly performing students in a period of 6 years. Through structural reform, through putting more sort of effort on teaching, very, very impressive. But if you can, and also the between school variation, Poland was one of the countries, like many European countries, with huge variability in school performance. And in a few years was able to actually raise the performance of poorly performing schools without losing out at the top end. The top end didn't do so much better, and in Poland, I think, and Jesse will probably talk about it, we have a fairly good understanding how reforms actually map to the kind of performance gains achieved. Portugal, another country, dramatically raising performance and improving equity. In Portugal, this has been also quite controversial sort of set of reforms, largely relating to the consolidation of the school system. Portugal had a system that wasn't really sustainable. Many schools, small schools scattered around the country, with some of them having more teachers than students, and basically putting a lot of effort into creating better learning environments in larger settings, and was quite successful with this. You have Hungary, another country in Eastern Europe, coming out from the lower end, moving upwards, also moving rightwards, improving quality and equity. Germany, my country, also being good at raising performance, but even better on improving equity. And the shock in PISA in Germany wasn't just about the low performance in Germany. It was very much related to the fact that people assumed, we're spending the same amount for teacher salaries, we have the same size of classes, everything is same, so we have achieved equity. And then they see the PISA results, and they see that equity in inputs doesn't guarantee equity in educational outcomes. So the efforts were mainly directed to raise sort of the performance of immigrant students, performance of students from disadvantaged social backgrounds, introducing a system of early childhood education and care. Lots of things really happened. The federal government improved its spending, and you can actually see that the big success was that, for example, the performance disadvantage of immigrant students halved in these years, which tells I often hear, well, we can't compare with Finland because we have more immigrants in Finland, we can't compare with that country because our culture is different. But if you look at all of those dots, these countries didn't change their culture in these years. No. They didn't change the teachers. They changed what they did, and actually you can see the list, unfortunately, isn't that much longer. Now, if you actually look around it, some other countries have partial success, partial improvement, but the countries that I've shown you among 74 countries are actually just a few where we can say that significant improvement has been achieved. One thing that the US, by the way, comes out without measurable, really, performance improvement, and that's actually, I should say, a third substantive comment I have on the report. I think you made it in the presentation, but I find the finding that performance gains in the US are smaller at the higher grades and at lower grades, a bit buried at the end of the report. For me, that's one of the most important messages. If you look at education from an outside perspective, from a labor market perspective, what happens at the early years, well, doesn't matter that much. The bottom line at the end of schooling is what's really critical. You can compare two countries. Very interesting. Finland and France. France brings every child to school with 3 years. They have really good scores in the first grades in terms of reading performance. At 4th grade, students do quite well. At 8th grade, they do so-so. In PISA, they come below the average. Very small growth rates. In Finland, they send their children to school with 7 years. And they see the highest grade-on-grade growth rates. In a sense that, in my view, is one of the most important determinants. To what extent do improvements in early grades translate into improvements in later grades? It also is a question for public policy, because if we find, for example, that the kind of reforms that seem to work well in improving scores in primary schooling don't work in higher grades, I think that's a very, very important lesson. I think many countries have learned that it's a lot easier to sort of improve reading and math scores in primary schooling with prescriptive methods of education. It's a lot harder to actually move that same distribution at the high end. So it's a very important finding. I wanted to just highlight one point. I think it's also well covered in Rick's report. You can look at social background and performance in a picture and put the schools in the United States. And it looks about like this. So here you can see basically how success of schools in the US depends on social background. On the right side, where you have more privileged background, schools do a lot better. But when you actually look at what we call in the OECD statistical neighbors, schools that operate in a similar socioeconomic context, you can see there's a lot of variability among schools that should achieve similar results. And if the US, and this holds for many countries, would only get its statistical neighbors closer together, so I'm not asking to raise everybody's performance, but just to ensure that sort of the lowest performing schools in a specific category reach the 75th percentile of the schools in that category, you would achieve very, very significant growth, bringing the US well above the average. And the same holds, by the way, for schools in privileged neighborhoods. You can see some are doing really well, but a lot of them are not reaching sort of high levels of standards. Very important findings. The last point I want to make, is one that moves beyond scores. And I think this is unfortunately often overlooked in the public debate. What are the kind of skills where students actually improve? If you take Japan, Japan basically knew they could do well multiple choice type reproduction knowledge tasks. In the rote learning, they were always good. They saw this in PISA and other tests. But Japan knew that they were actually much poorer in answering open-ended tasks requiring critical thinking, the production of knowledge, and so on. So Japan's reform over the last 10, actually 15 years, very much focused on strengthening the kind of critical thinking skills of students. And actually, when you look at results over the last years, the OECD has actually seen more progress on this kind of open-ended, constructed questions than on multiple choice questions. Most countries have sort of given that a lot more emphasis. But if you look at Japan, actually, they have been very, very successful in moving forward, in achieving growth in this kind of advanced thinking skills. And that doesn't translate into scores. You know, if you just look at test scores, it's buried. It's masked by this. But I think it's a very important perspective when we actually analyze achievement growth, that we do look behind aggregate scores and sort of look at change in growth patterns that go beyond this. And actually, it tells you a lot about instructional policies and reform in countries. I just wanted to conclude my presentation with sort of a few remarks on, if this comes up, a few remarks on what we have found out about factors that our statistical models relate to performance and performance growth. Some of them are obvious to you, things like discipline, teacher behavior, and the only indicator of teacher behavior that really predicts both performance and performance growth is what students say about classrooms. Parental expectations, very important factor. Teacher-student relationships, something that you can actually see. When you see how countries deal with diversity, things like grade, repetition, work against the system, work against schools, and work against equity. Tracking, you can see working against equity, not necessarily performance. Getting rid of students works against the system, works also against the school. For me, that was one of the most fascinating findings. You would think, you know, if you are a school and you can get rid of your poorest performing students, you should actually see a lot of growth, but actually doesn't seem to hold over time. Ability grouping, it's a complex pattern. It only visible when it you look at across all subjects. National examination, sort of standards, goals, very important predictor at the system level for system performance. Standardized tests is not so clear. We can see clearly positive relationships to factors of equity. We can't see sort of a relationship with performance. Posting results publicly, very controversial topic in many countries, but it at least relates positively to school performance. And I tell you, these are all results after accounting for all sorts of socioeconomic factors. So this is a pure net result. School autonomy, you can see relating quite positively to system performance and school performance and improvement. That's one of the biggest changes in many of the systems that have seen the biggest improvements. But it's always working positively when tied into a system of public accountability, which, by the way, and that's important for a US audience, is not always about tests. Public accountability is about knowledge management within the system, and there are some countries that don't use tests at all but have very powerful systems of knowledge management. Choice and competition sort of work so-so. Once you account for social background, you don't see a positive relationship much, and often you also don't see, you see a negative relationship on equity. Private schools or charter schools, also we can't detect sort of international pattern. And on resources, I think I said about everything. These are the things that you can sort of formulate in the way of statistical methods. Let me talk about some factors that really require a lot of more nuanced analysis, observation, and which can be sort of much harder to make, much harder conclusions to make. But I want to still raise them. When you look at average systems and systems that perform very high, one of the most impressive outcomes is the fact that high-performing systems really enable all students to learn at very high levels. There is no trade-off between quality and equity across OECD countries. Very interesting finding. The way in which countries embrace diversity in students' populations, basically understanding that different students learn differently, personalizing learning. You can see Finland providing 30% of instruction time outside formal classroom settings, investing a lot of resources actually in sort of tailoring instruction to individual students' needs. The East Asian countries do that as well. They do it usually after school with kind of private tutoring arrangements, but it's very much the same principle. It's the idea of learner-centered education systems. The high-performing systems in PISA, the rapidly improving systems, have very much focused on sort of learner-centered education. Teachers, obviously, attracting and developing high-quality teachers is a common feature. The attracting part, not as much as the development and retaining. The idea that all high-performing systems attract great people into teaching is actually not sustained by data. You have countries, I mean, Canada would be a great example. You pretty much get average people teaching, and the same is true for many high-performing systems, but the investment in teaching is actually very, very significant. Singapore, very common number, 100 hours of professional development per year per teacher. Shanghai, I just was in Shanghai yesterday, 240 hours of investment in teachers. Very, very significant investment in, and very, very good at attracting the most talented teachers into the most challenging schools, sort of having very, very good systems of distribution. How they deal with the teachers, and that's sort of a controversial item. Prescription versus sort of creating an informed profession. Many of the systems at the high end have really put a lot of emphasis on creating the kind of professional environment that gives teachers a lot of professional discretion and autonomy. Clearly, systems have a much greater focus on outcomes than on the provision. You can sort of see that even in our quantitative data quite clearly. How they look outwards, basically how the systems enable teachers to learn from other teachers, how they enable schools to learn from other schools, and so on. Administrative control and accountability versus professional forms of work organization, sort of a big issue as well in many of the systems. And you can see sort of a tendency for many high-performing systems, actually at least to aspire to more professional forms of work organization. That even holds for some of the systems with the most rigid systems. Distribution of resources, I've mentioned that already. One of the most interesting finding, and that's also, I mean, Poland will be a fascinating story as well. How you get the most talented teachers into the most challenging classroom. How you get the best principals into the most difficult schools. And when Shanghai did it, I discussed it yesterday, again, you know, my question has always been, yeah, you take your great teachers away from your key schools, from your high-performing schools. What does it do to these key schools? And actually, the evidence so far suggests that there's been almost no loss. Actually, there has been no loss, no measurable loss for these high-performing schools, but huge gains for the schools at the bottom. School leadership, that's very, very hard to quantify, but we do see that sort of there has been a shift away from managing schools towards really providing what we call instructional leadership, where principals play a very significant role in sort of shaping an environment. Public versus private, you know, that's a very interesting question. You can see, for example, citing Finland again, you know, every public school in Finland has more discretion, more responsibility, more accountability than a private school in France, for example. So you can actually see high-performing systems, the boundary between public, private, voucher schools, and so on, doesn't really matter anymore that much. And then finally, and I think Michael has made that point already much stronger, is that those systems have moved away from idiosyncratic reforms where layers and layers are put on top to really an alignment of policies that make them coherent. Alignment over time, that's a very important dimension as well. You can actually see when you look at what countries have done over time, do those things actually match up? And they do. And then finally, fidelity of implementation. Do you actually do in the classroom what you say at the system level? I mean, the delivery chain from intended through implemented through achieved reform is a very, very interesting factor to observe when you look at high-performing systems. And my time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas. I'm sure many of you share my feelings of being both heartened by these remarkable stories of countries that have turned their education systems around, but also somewhat dismayed that the United States isn't actually leading that group. Our next speaker is John Schnur.
Great. Thank you. I'll say this is a humbling room to be in, much less share some wisdom in. These are some of the greatest minds and experts that you've heard from and around the table in the room that you have in one place, and that's testament to Paul and Eric and others for convening this, the Kern Foundation for funding and supporting it. I've got some insights to share about the practicalities, maybe in a large scale way, but the practicalities of what are the implications of this for the point that Rick mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And how do you break this enigma in a U.S. context to try to apply some of this to drive change? And I've got some observations about that, some hypotheses to offer. I also would note that the person I've known longest in the room, who I haven't seen in a long time, is Ed Glaeser, who, in fact, we were in the same dormitory freshman year back at Princeton, and it's great to see you, Ed.
Great to see you, John.
And in fact, I think your recent book, one of the findings from that, I think, is a huge driver of both the need and the potential platform for urgency in terms of focusing on this in the country, looking across communities. I think if I have this right, you found that the cities with the 1 in 3 people with post-secondary degrees had something like 50% less unemployment than those with 1 in 6. And essentially, at the community level, we're really seeing a stratification of America, not just by students, but by community. And I think that's a powerful, should be a powerful motivator for understanding that we both have a crisis in this country about how we help individual kids succeed, but for people who are in a decentralized system in this country who care about their community, understand that the success of their community in the U.S. is going to depend on how well we apply this evidence and solve those problems. So I'll offer some there's some thoughts about how this gets applied in the U.S. context in a few ways. And again, there are other people with expertise around the room who will, some of this is sort of drawn from, who will have different perspectives, and I know we'll have good discussion about that. The first I'd start with here, a little counterintuitively given what we've heard, but I think there's an asset in the U.S. before I talk about some of the problems that I do want to focus on. Among other things, we have an asset in a significantly growing number of individual schools in the U.S. and clustered in particular states, there's no question, but across the country, that actually are people at the grassroots level in the U.S., teachers, principals, school districts working with those folks, who've had sort of transformative success at the school level overall and achieving results for low-income kids with, I think, really like deeply held takeaways that those educators and others have had that fortunately very much match the evidence in some ways about what's being presented today about what countries are doing at large scale. Now, the systems level change to make that possible is obviously a huge leap, but I just want to sort of observe in some of this work I saw in my role running New Leaders for New Schools for a decade, where we had the benefit of 700 leaders that we had selected from 15 times as many applicants, going into schools around the country, had partnerships with some of you in this room, including with Nancy Grasmick in Maryland, is really one of our first state-level partnerships. And while the results are interesting in this, the results mirrored the U.S. in some ways. The New Leaders-led schools made incrementally better progress than the school systems they were in by Rand's account, but not dramatically so. It was about a subset of those schools. We found about 15 or 20% of those schools, which really made transformative improvements based on a variety of outcome measures. So we studied pretty carefully what happened in those schools compared to schools that were making, schools that we knew well in more incremental gains. Now, these were well-trained leaders, well-selected leaders in about 10 school systems. So we were able to account for kind of in-system variation across systems. And the findings from that will not surprise you, so I'm not here to sort of give you a big ahas in this, except to say that there are now growing numbers of educators and those work with educators in this country who understand these points that are being made here in a research-based ways at the system level. Number one, in all these schools we looked at that made bigger improvements, there were really specific high expectations for what kids should know and be able to do by grade level. They were both academic expectations in terms of content. They were often, in fact, how kids ought to think. And they also were around character strengths, really, and kind of what the kind of expectations were for how kids should be and interact with each other. And what I would say is we saw a lot of schools where they said that, but in fact there were certain schools where it was deeply understood by the educators in the school that were very rigorous expectations for all the kids that actually moved things significantly. Secondly, we saw a ever-present focus on a critical mass of leaders at the school level. Not only the principal, but a critical mass principal, assistant principal, a set of teachers, maybe there's an outside group, but in every one of these cases, there was a group of leaders who were sort of aligned to both a sense of urgency and agency and a shared vision for how to make improvement, specifically in what type of instruction and what type of culture would actually move outcomes for kids toward those high expectations. Third, there was in fact this, and they wouldn't always talk about it this way, but a data-driven focus on continuous improvement. They were constantly getting better based on the best data that they could come up with. And fourth, there was always a focus on teaching, on quality teaching, to attract good teachers and retain good teachers and develop good teachers, and the best, you figure out how to keep the best teachers there, and yes, how to move out teachers who, after they had gotten support, would be moved out one way or the other, which is possible in a unionized setting, at least at the school level, in a reasonably easy way. But hard work, but it's possible. But those sort of themes came from those schools, and yet most of our own new leaders who we had trained with kind of the best in class principal training in the U.S. weren't doing those things. It's in part because of the systemic problems that haven't been solved, which I'll get to in a minute. It's in part because we based our own model, actually, interestingly, which I think we got to be careful of in this discussion at the beginning of New Leaders, on what the principals in the best schools were doing, as opposed to what the principals were doing in schools that were in a situation like the schools they were going in and what they needed to do to improve. And so often we misapplied the lessons. In some ways, Andreas referred to this. If you say, what is Finland doing, that may not be as relevant as what a country is, where the U.S. is, or a U.S. state is, to move to the next level. And we misapplied that. One of the things I think we found, again, underscoring one of Andreas' points, is that in the low achieving school, in the highest achieving schools, we found a very collaborative type of leadership where it was really about a lot of people involved in decision making and empowerment of people to move toward. And yet, when we go into the low achieving, low capacity schools, it turned out that there was a fairly, I must say, prescriptive leadership at the beginning around getting people to understand what good instruction looked like and building capacity. And they didn't actually build out, kind of distribute the leadership until the team had been built. And we misapplied that. We actually, at the beginning of New Leaders, tried to actually help the principals do in low achieving schools what principals were already doing in high achieving schools. And we lost several years until we realized that wasn't working. So I think that's an interesting lesson we saw that has application for, well, McKinsey's looked at this from a school system perspective as well, for what Andreas is saying. But the reason I say these things is not because these are necessarily new to most people, and in fact, they're not even that different from what you heard, except to say we have a growing number of educators in this country who have experienced this at a school level. So when it's just done right, when the right policy and systems change is being done, this is not new to at least a growing number of folks. The question is how you can leverage those people. So that's an asset we have that I think sometimes is not leveraged enough. So that's kind of one first set of points. Second, and so those are some observations about the school level and how that's an asset based in the U.S. that we can leverage. Secondly, when I look at the, there's some interesting analysis today about kind of the differences among countries and some of the factors that Andreas referred to and Michael and Rick referred to around to some extent, but especially Andreas and Michael around what were some of the explanations for what some of the differences between countries' level of improvement and success. I just want to quickly, this is not from a study of this, but I have been involved in, a lot of the U.S. states, U.S. districts, so I've been able to see many of the states that are at the high end of this chart, low end of this chart, and I'll offer a few observations about what I've seen about some common factors among the high-performing states in the U.S. that are in this chart versus the low-performing states that I think are relevant. And then I'm going to sort of finish on how I think what some key factors come out of this and how to sort of break this enigma, as Rick put it. When you look at these states, again, I think that I don't know which chart it is, but the one that shows the states on this curve. He mentioned the gold medal winner is Maryland. And we're so fortunate to have Nancy Grasmick in the room. It is not a surprise that Nancy Grasmick was the longest-serving state superintendent in the entire United States. And I must say, for being the gold winner and as a state in the U.S., you're here. I do really want to give an extra hand of applause to Nancy for your leadership. So you'll also correct me what I say wrong on this, given what you sort of presided over in Maryland, Nancy. But what I would say is, in fact, that the states at the high end of that curve, both in terms of improvement, are states that had a sustained focus on statewide change, reflecting some of many of the core principles that were articulated here. But there were leadership, often a state superintendent, usually not just, often a statewide civic group. Terry Peterson was very involved in this in South Carolina as a model and talks about this. Often a few set of elected officials, but there was kind of a critical mass of leaders who stayed with this year after year, decade after decade, doing the kinds of things that were discussed in the report, although now we're taking them to new levels. And I must say that when you look at, really with almost without exception, when you look at Massachusetts, that was certainly true, and David Driscoll is an enormously central part of that. Maryland, that was true. Florida, that was true. This is not a partisan. You got Democrats, Republicans. Jeb Bush in Florida was a very significant part of that. Delaware, interesting. Delaware had a civic group that was really, in some ways, the large leader in Delaware that's sort of driven that across time. New Jersey's an interesting one that doesn't get often talked about, and I think New Jersey's an interesting one to go more into to look at what happened in New Jersey. But that sustained, focused leadership at the state level is just a key differentiator, literally among every one of these states that have made the biggest improvements. And so I'll come back to that. But that's one observation I would make to you about that. A second observation in terms of the state level work is that, in the interest of time, we're just going to go to to underscore the importance of something that was raised before, which is the presence of the fact that more of the low performing states made more progress in the U.S., which was true, I think, in the domestic data, wasn't true in the global data. And I think that's an interesting thing to come back to in a minute. Well, why is that? Why would the low achieving states here be making mostly more progress than the high achieving states, even though that's not true globally? It doesn't have to be the case. Massachusetts demonstrates, Maryland demonstrates that's not the case. It's two high-performing states, relatively speaking, that made improvements. So you show it can be done, but for the most part, I think that's a really crucial fact to look at about why that's true. And so then, okay, then let me just move into, with some of those observations, what are the keys to breaking the policy enigma that Rick talked about? And I had my notes from that. He, I think, had, he talked about you recognize the value of education, recognize the need for improvement, set challenging goals, and then failure, I think was his account of that. So I would offer a few key points about why that's true, and I think how we have to break out of this, that augment the substantive work you've heard. I agree. I mean, what Michael and Andreas shared about what's been learned, I think, is just spot on in terms of system reform. Michael Fullen has just done so much crucial work that goes into this very deeply about what's needed. And I would say, okay, we don't have time. I'm not going to spend more time on those substantively, except to say I think those are the right things. But they haven't taken hold. So why haven't they taken hold, and what can make them take hold in the U.S. at scale in a way that we've only been able to do at the school level or in a few individual states so far? Number one is I think we haven't focused squarely on the right unit level of change in the U.S. And I say that as somebody who I'm a big supporter. I believe President Obama has been courageous and engaged on education, worked for President Clinton. I think he was too. President Bush was a very focused. We've had presidents actually who've been very focused on education in significant ways. And I think that's probably been a largely pretty good thing. But that's not the unit of change here, as we know. We have a decentralized system. We have 15,000 school districts. You have 50 states. And when you do the things that Rick described about setting goals, but not actually at the unit of change that actually can do something about it, it doesn't lead to much. You set goals for, if we set goals for what those of us in this room would do over the next 3 years together, and then left, nothing much would happen. We don't really have a system here. I mean, Michael Fullen's point about whole systems reform, I think is just the absolute key here. The federal government is not a system. I think the federal government has a very important role to play. And if I don't have time in my comments, we have time in a panel discussion, I can talk about my views about the crucial role the federal government has to play. I think President Obama is really right on this at a high level of incenting work at the state and local level, maintaining federal funding to focus on equity, given the share of federal funding that goes to low achieving schools, trying to advance and incent and support a couple key things like the Common Core, which are state-led, but with federal incentives. I think that those are just the right balance, but those are not going to solve the problems. Those are just going to help create better conditions to solve the problems. The unit of change here, I think fundamentally, I think in the end is actually the real unit of change is at the school level, but only made possible by large-scale systems that create the conditions to support that. Now, many of you know this, and I'm presuming to say this in front of some of you is sort of like, of course we know that. But in fact, practically, we haven't as a country looked at how do we actually focus on the state and district and city role that Ed alluded to at the beginning of this discussion, actually is the catalytic force for driving whole systems reform. Those have largely been, with some just tremendous exceptions, David Driscoll and Nancy Grasmick being in a small number of those, they've been a few bright spots among a sea of kind of mediocrity and absence of focus. We actually haven't really looked in the U.S. overall at what kind of leadership we need there, what kind of systems change we need there, and then we act as if at the national level that those goals or policies will make change when they're just preconditions. So I think for an individual state, the lessons of this are much easier. I think for an engaged leader, a set of leaders coming to a state, I think some very clear lessons from this research that's been described about what can be done. I think a conundrum and a dilemma is what do you do in a decentralized system that can actually help us as a country move forward, knowing that we've actually got to get a whole lot of states and cities to do that. And so I think while these lessons are fantastic for the right leaders in some bright spot states and cities, what we do about that as a national issue in a federalist system, I think is a very significant challenge. And I must say, I don't have answers to that. I'm really interested in Germany as an interesting example, which is probably the country that's actually both the biggest country that's the highest performing, that's sort of somewhat got some similarities in what the improvements have been there. I think there have been prior some insights. I think that's a dilemma for us that we haven't spent enough time on in education. Secondly, in terms of my what it'll take to apply this, I think this data that you heard today underscores this. I think that a lack of understanding in our country about where we are in our particular communities and states against where we need to be for our kids to be successful and that lack of urgency that comes out from that is a huge problem. Now, some people might hear this and say, well, how is that true? An NBC poll came out this week, some of you may have seen, that actually Americans named the quality of public schools as the #1 threat to America's future. That was more Americans said that was our biggest threat than literally anything else. And see how well isn't that urgency? Or you could cite other data showing that 80% of Americans think our schools are in crisis and give them very bad grades. And doesn't that show we know we got a real problem? I think there's a lot of windows into this, but one piece of data that I think underscores this is 80% of Americans think our schools are in crisis, and some of you know this. But 80% of parents think that their local schools are doing fine in the U.S. And generally, I think people, including, I mean, that percentage aren't quite as high among parents in low-achieving schools. It's not 80, but it actually is still around 60%. That for the most part, people think the crisis they hear about are in someone else's school, in someone else's community and state. So when data comes out, like the data that's come out from some terrific reports that you put out, Rick, and that Andreas puts out, and OECD puts out, people generally, yeah, there is that problem that those people have, and what are they going to do about that? And nothing changes. And I think that addressing that is a second dilemma. How do we actually establish that sense of urgency? I think at the state level, again, I think if you look at some states that have done this, well, there's clearly been effort at the state level with great leadership to be able to do that, but nationally, we haven't had that. I think one promising thing I would flag here, and this is just the beginning of some work on this, is how to make that data available to leaders in a much more localized way. Andreas, OECD has been driving this. The Kern Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies have been supporting it. We've been helping America achieve. Is this project to have 100 U.S. high schools this spring took a school-level version of the PISA, or an examination against the PISA frameworks, where the schools will be getting results back later this year, where they can look at how their individual schools did, urban, suburban, rural, low-income, moderate-income, higher-income schools against the rest of the world. And I think the reason they step forward is they want to know, how are we doing against the best of the world? And I think that this is a pilot, but I think it's got real promise, because I think that the OECD is interested if this goes well in expanding. I think the Common Core has a lot of benefits, but I think embedding a kind of ability to look at how schools do compared to the rest of the globe is another chance to do this. But I think we can make that data more localized. That's not the only thing that's needed. Again, obviously we need the leadership at the local and state level. We need the content that's been described. But I think that with the right effort to make sure that that's really readily available could really help. And then the third thing I would say, if we've got to solve for this dilemma of how to get a bunch of states and cities working on this in a federalist system. Second is, how do we establish urgency when people have urgency about the country's crisis but don't about their own? The third and last one I just think is a leadership issue, especially a pipeline and support for leaders at the local and state level. So how do we have many more David Driscolls, Nancy Grasmicks, some of the superintendents, some of the civic leaders and organizations? That's not in this country going to be a federal government-driven effort. Largely, I think that the federal government, the bully pulpit focusing on it, a president focusing on it, makes education more attractive. I think that is one of the central challenges that face, I think, the nonprofit sector and the philanthropic sector, and civic groups, and how does that leadership pipeline get created and supported that can actually apply these lessons. So I think that I will only make one last other note that I just see as a dilemma that I think Michael mentioned, or Andreas briefly mentioned as well. I think this question of what outcomes we are focused on is really crucial, not only to drive the substantive work, but in order to actually have our educators in our country engaged in this work. I think the Common Core represents an enormous opportunity to have assessments that are based on, that are on much more rigorous standards, that are much more focused standards, that are better than most of the state standards in terms of preparing kids for college and careers. And I think that's a step in the right direction. But even beyond better academic assessments, I think we need to have educators and families and students motivated by their sense of achieving goals that are going to matter for the long haul. I think the issue of looking at some things like collaborative problem solving is an interesting part of that. I think looking at things like character strengths, I'm not saying that these can be in globalized comparable assessments, but nonetheless character strengths of the kind of like persistence and grit and engagement, the kind of things that actually drive success, is important. And I think our being able to focus in schools and communities on a set of goals, including academic outcomes, college enrollment, college completion, certainly another example, I think is not only substantively going to matter, but I actually think that if we can't mobilize in this country the level of engagement we need without people understanding how a set of goals is something they're working toward that actually will matter to their long-term future in a way that's more, that's broader than only the important focus on better academic results. So with that, I'll finish and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, John. Rick, I want to start the questioning off with you, and I want to sort of bring us down to the U.S. heterogeneity in outcomes. I think there's sort of both the high end and the low end. I'm struck by two sets of facts. In terms of the low end, just this regional graph that they started off here shows the remarkable decline in the American West. I mean, in some sense, it just feels like a national tragedy that Iowa, in some sense, the birthplace of the high school movement in the U.S., has done so badly over the last 10 years. And I wanted you to reflect a little bit on whether or not you think that this was politics or resources. And I know we don't think that money matters, but people certainly matter. And indeed, many of these places that have done poorly are places that are declining, that are losing talent at the sort of larger labor force. How important are the different forces in accounting for the decline of the West? And then I wanted to also ask you, if you would, as you're reflecting on that, to talk about two visions of success. Two of your graphs and have two different outliers in terms of places succeeding well. This is his graph of changes in test scores on cash. Florida is the big outlier here, right? Florida is a place that has achieved outstanding improvement in test score scores without spending a penny, as far as I can tell, right? They managed to do it incredibly cheaply. And the other graph is the convergence graph, which is the change in test scores on initial test scores. And here, in fact, it's Massachusetts that's the outlier, although Maryland is also extraordinary, and I don't want to in any sense take anything away, but Massachusetts appears, eyeballing it, to have the biggest distance from the graph, that we are the sort of spot in here that, despite starting at a fairly high level, has achieved the most. Talk about the difference between the Maryland or Massachusetts models, if you will, and the Florida model as well, and sort of different visions for how we make things better.
So I'm surprised you asked me. We have John Wynn, the instrument of Jeb Bush for improving Florida. It is true that if you normalize the gains by dollars spent, Florida just pops out as getting the biggest gains per dollar spent. I think that all of these cases comes back to what John was saying, that there was unique, strong leadership that was willing to do something a bit different than had been done. Change in the school systems involves doing something different than what's going on. It's not reducing class size by half a student and hoping that that's going to dramatically change what's going on. And I think that that's what you see in Iowa and Nebraska. Iowa, the birthplace of the ACT test, refused to test students in the state for a long time and was forced into it because they were complacent. They thought everything was going well. They'd started high schools and they were number one in 1992, and they didn't want to have any accountability system for a long time. Same with Nebraska, refused to have a statewide test. I think they still do. I'm not sure. That they're the exception of No Child Left Behind. And so it's a matter, to me, of recognizing that the value of change is so enormous that it's worth thinking about quite different ways to go about it. But as I look at it, we've got the representatives here, Nancy and John and Dave and Terry can talk about different things done in different states. It's not a one approach, one method does everything. I think they did quite different things, but it was a focus on performance. And I have to correct one other thing while I've got the microphone, my last correction. If we could be Canada, it's not $45 trillion, it's $75 trillion, or 5 times the U.S. current GDP in present value terms. The $45 trillion is, if we could just be Germany, which is not quite as far ahead, but is moving away from us.
Great, thank you, Rick. One of the things I think that came out, Andreas, of your talk was the remarkable heterogeneity of ways in which systems got better, and I think that's a common echo through all this. Although you did point out that teacher autonomy seems to be one of the correlates of success. John then raised the idea that in fact teacher autonomy is often a sign of success rather than a cause of success, in the sense that it actually, once you've got teachers that are up and running, once you've got them that are capable, then you can give them more autonomy. And that corresponds with a general lesson in economics, that indeed the better your people, the more you want to just let them run for it. And the more problems that you have, the more that you have to impose tighter control. How confident are you that there's a sort of causal relationship here as we look at these things versus being things that are more likely to be seen as correlates of success?
Yeah, when you look at this in a cross-sectional manner, you actually can't disentangle cause and effect on those kinds of relationships. When you look at actually reform trajectories, you can actually see that in many countries it's been a deliberate strategy to actually create a more professional form of work organization for teachers. We're giving much greater emphasis. If you actually, I mean, one of the countries that did this first was, in fact, Finland. You know, Finland wasn't always a great performing education system. In the 60s, they were an average performer. And they had a highly prescriptive environment, a kind of highly structured system, and they put much of their effort into basically strengthening this. But, you know, teacher autonomy in itself is not a variable that actually explains success. You can go to France or Spain, where actually schools have zero autonomy and teachers have 100% of autonomy. Nobody actually knows what's happening in the classroom. So that's not a model that actually works out well. I think the question is really about the kind of work organizations. How do you connect teachers? How do you spread and share knowledge throughout the system? And how do you build those kinds of systems that capitalize on the potential of great people in the system? And I think that's where you can see some systems making a deliberate effort on this. You know, as I mentioned, I just came back from Shanghai, which is a place that has actually, you know, when they started out, they had a very, very poor schooling environment. Even 2003, they were doing quite poorly by OECD measures. And they would have liked to hire, 100,000 new teachers. They didn't have them. So basically, they again started out, how can we actually capitalize on what our best teachers know for our system, spread that knowledge, put those teachers where they can make most of a difference. And I think that's really it. When you look at this in a kind of growth perspective, you can actually make assertions that this is one of the drivers in those kind of reforms.
Great, thank you. Sir Michael, you raised the promise of technology, and I'm one of my hats, as I said, on the advisory board of the Gates Foundation's educational group, and Gates has certainly made a large bet on technology, and indeed from this I've learned about things like Manga High, which I afterwards forced on my kids. But I'm skeptical, or at least I'm skeptical of what I've seen so far. I've been underwhelmed by the lack of serious randomized evaluations and so forth. And can you say a little bit more about how you imagine technology transforming education in a meaningful way?
Sure. I mean, I just want to comment on or follow on from Andreas, and then come to that point. So I think that as systems improve, the nature of the reform changes. So I think Eric mentioned this earlier. So when you've got an awful system and you want to make it adequate, you can pretty much mandate it, and you should, because it's urgent. Mm-hmm. So the way I put it, you can mandate awful to adequate, but you can't mandate greatness. I mean, in fact, the English language won't even let you say mandate greatness, because it doesn't make sense. So you have to unleash, you mandate awful to adequate, but greatness has to be unleashed. And that's where you get into school autonomy and what Michael Fullan talks about a lot, peer pressure. So a professional expectation that this is what good looks like, and we're going to expect it in our school. And that actually relates to the technology point, because I think that the risk, and I share your skepticism, if you just focus on the technology, this is never going to be right. It's thinking about how to change the system in the line of the kind of stuff Andreas was talking about, John was talking about, we were all talking about actually, how you develop the teaching profession and get the teaching profession to focus on teaching and learning, or pedagogy, to use the jargon, and then think about how technology is going to assist with that reform. Right. So it might be helping with data systems, it might be giving teachers better tools to do more beautiful presentations, it might be giving teachers access to better individualized student data so that they can see instantly who's going ahead, who's falling behind, and do something about it. It might be sharing best practices so that across a whole system you can have a teacher using online learning materials. She's struggling with Latino students in her class. She can go to the system and say, is there some teacher somewhere in this system that knows how to teach Latino students this particular unit of mathematics, and learn that and apply it. So the technology will be an enabler of whole system and improve teacher quality. And then there is growing evidence, I wouldn't say it's totally conclusive, that blended models where you're using, and some of the experimentation in the US is crucial here, blended models of high schools which have been allowed and enabled by the charter movement show real promise. In the last conversation I had with Arnie Duncan, he was really saying we need to do more of that kind of thing as part of the next stage of reform, and I totally agree.
That certainly makes sense. John, I just loved your fact that we all believe that we're a nation at risk and imperiled, but we all think our own school systems are fine. I would have guessed, and I'm just sort of inviting you to speculate more about the heterogeneity within the U.S., I would have guessed that we have basically three types of scenarios in the U.S. We have the well-performing districts in Montgomery County, Maryland, or Middlesex County, Massachusetts, where the parents basically never take their eye off the ball, where if there's a problem in the school, they're on top of this. And then we have many large city school districts where no one is confused that this district is a problem, but it's not like anyone in Detroit is sitting around saying that their school district is great, or it's not even that anyone in Boston is saying that everything is well with the school district. It's just the problems of affecting change are just so enormous that, one of the things I think that we take away from, the 8 years of Joel Klein's leadership is even with the most extraordinary person that you can think of trying to move a big city school district, it's enormously hard to move that lever in a large way, in part because of the political challenges, in part because of just the difficulties of such a large system. And then there are vast numbers of smaller districts in the U.S. which are exactly the situation, I think, that you're talking about, which is they are underperforming and the parents are complacent. Is that a reasonable view of America, or do you think I'm being too rosy about the high performing districts, or too negative on the big cities?
I mean, my sense is it's a great question. And then I have a comment on the technology piece too for a minute. But I don't have a good data to support this. But from the time I've spent in various states and school systems around the country, I think you're right with probably it being something like 10% being in one category, 10% being in one category, and 80% being in the third.
In the third category.
And I think that you have a very small number of systems where on the Montgomery counties of the world, I think are just tremendous exceptions. And I'll say this, I went to public schools in Wisconsin that I graduated from just before we met originally, and now we live out in Montclair, New Jersey, outside New York City, and our kids go to what are considered really excellent public schools in New Jersey, which ranks as one of the highest states ranking states in the country. My first grader, now second grader's chief complaint is the math is too easy. It is. It's a good school, caring teachers, and will as parents be able to make up for this. Most parents, I think, in the community of Montclair, think it's fine and are complacent. So the Montgomery counties, I think, are pretty exceptions. The Detroits are real exceptions. I think that most of America is in the middle. The one other thing I want to say, because I know you may want to have a quick follow-up with that on technology, I just think that technology, we're on technology today, my view is about where we were with charter schools in the U.S. in the mid-1990s. And my sense is the most likely trajectory is what's happened to the charter schools, which is good and bad. My bet is, although we have the power to just make this better as a country if we leverage it, is that we're going to have pockets of places in the coming years which are going to apply the insights that Michael was describing and how technology actually linked with building teacher capacity and systems reform winds up making some transformative gains. And just like some of the highest quality charter schools are, some of the highest achieving low-income schools in the country, and give us some lessons learned that really push the rest of the country. And my bet is the way most people are thinking about technology in education and systems and the state of technology, on average, charter schools haven't done any better than the rest of education in America. And my bet is technology is going to wind up being the same. And the question to me is, how do we actually try to not only make those seeds of innovation work, but make that to be a larger scale in the coming years?
It's fascinating.
I just want to make one note of extension on that, which is why I totally agree with that, and that would be the pattern in the US with any major change because of the diverse system and the 15,000 school districts. But I think you will see in some systems, maybe Singapore, maybe elsewhere, where they will combine whole system reform with systemic innovation and generate the whole system revolution I was talking about.
Sounds great. All right. Well, we've got about 20 minutes left. I'd love to open it up to questions from the floor. Yes, sir. You could also just state your name and maybe something about your affiliation.
My name is Paul Haas. I'm a Massachusetts public school teacher, retired. I'd like to ask Andreas what have the countries from around the world done to objectively or quantifiably identify the better teachers, number one? How they identify those better teachers, and number two, how have they gotten them to want to go into the neediest districts?
Yeah, one of the toughest questions. Actually, what I can say is very few countries have metrics that are based on student performance. Actually, when you look at teacher selection, much of this is still done on the basis of professional judgment, where in some countries principals have a big say in evaluating teachers. Sort of what I can say, most high-performing systems have robust systems of teacher evaluation, but very few are able actually to do that on the basis of student performance. This is an area where I think the United States is more advanced than most other countries, where the link between student test scores and teacher work is quite well established. If you look around the world, most countries rely much more on kind of other forms of peer or professional judgments being made at the level of the school or through external evaluators, inspection systems and things like this. The second question is equally interesting. How do they get the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms? If you go, for example, I mean, the country that, or the system that has done that most systematically, Shanghai in China. You know, if you are...
They had a lot of freedom to choose which school district
actually they do. Actually, I think the idea that this is probably, it's one of the systems with the greatest levels of school autonomy, where actually the system wouldn't even dare to intervene in any school's performance. You have a marketplace. You can do what you want as a school as long as you do well. Schools have a lot more autonomy in the case of Shanghai than in the United States. You have a lot of district autonomy. You don't have a lot of school autonomy in the United States compared with Shanghai. But back to your question, what is really interesting is that if, for example, they have a very clear career path for teachers. There's not one status of a teacher, but you can move upwards. And the only way you move upwards in your career is actually to show that you can turn around a poor-performing classroom, a poor-performing school. You don't have to do that. Teachers apply. But you can actually see lots of teachers volunteering for actually taking on those challenges because it moves them up in their career and it brings a lot of professional prestige. Basically, your track record as a teacher, your career path is very much influenced by what you have been able to achieve in changing classroom, changing schools. So when we talk about growth, this is really what it is about. Your career is not shaped whether you are in a key school. You know, you don't gain prestige by basically ending up in a high-performing or being in a high-performing school. You gain prestige as a teacher by actually show that you can change things. Now that's sort of extreme case done in the most systematic way. If you look to Finland. You know, what's the most fascinating piece of data about Finland? Not that they do well on average, but that only 5% of the performance variability among students lies between schools. Every school succeeds. And they do that in the same way. They share knowledge, they spread knowledge, they basically create environments. If you're in a poor-performing school, or if there is a poor-performing school, a school with a lot of disadvantage, there's a lot of resources going into this. As a teacher, you do have a lot more opportunities to actually try out things, develop new practices than if you work in another school. So it's basically the kind of incentive structures that shape those kinds of policies and practices. And for us, the best measure of this is actually between school variability. How have countries, when you look at growth, how have countries been successful to move statistical neighbors closer to each other, basically reducing unexplained performance variability among schools in the system?
Rick, you wanted in on that.
I just wanted to add one quick thing. In the U.S., the debate about teacher evaluations has come down to being one about whether we should use test scores or not. And I think that that's absolutely the wrong debate. I've been heavily involved with Steve Rivkin and others in looking at value additive teachers on test scores, which gives us a good metric of how different teachers are. But it turns out that's never going to be the evaluation system, either individually as sole use of that or even the majority. If you look at Washington, D.C., which has introduced serious evaluations of teachers with outside evaluators on an objective method that doesn't use test scores, only 20% of Washington, D.C. teachers can be evaluated on test scores. The remaining 80% are evaluated in other methods. But it's not, I don't think it's right to quite say that it doesn't pay attention to student achievement, because what we found is that good evaluation systems do pay attention to student achievement, they just don't use the test scores
Right.
as the way to do it.
I absolutely agree. I think that's a fair point.
There was a question in back there, yeah.
Well, it kind of follows on this. Andreas had left a simple sentence about that there are powerful evaluation systems out there that. Andreas had left us with a simple sentence that there are powerful evaluation systems that don't rely on test scores, and I was eager to hear a little bit more what that looked like. It sounds like we got some from Eric, but if there's more in other countries, I'd love to know.
Yeah, and I actually just use this to reinforce the point Eric just made. 40% of OECD countries use student performance to actually rate teachers, evaluate teachers. So that is a very common practice, but a very few use test scores. There are observations in classrooms. There are basically school principals in many countries actually have it as a responsibility to actually observe classrooms, make judgments on this. Peer evaluation, there are many, many kinds of approaches that countries use to evaluate student performance. Simply, and I think the simple answer is because they don't have data systems that allow them to make kind of database judgments. They rely on, or they believe that, test scores are only a very partial perspective on the quality of work that teachers do. There are a lot of other aspects that are involved in this as well.
I just want to add to that I think where there are well-designed school inspection systems, they can be very effective. There are a variety of different, it's a whole other debate, but where the school inspection system is well-focused, gets at classroom practice and reports on that can be a very powerful process.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm interested in the role of remediation.
No one is remembering my initial thing, which is to state their name and affiliation.
Oh, yeah, I'm David Anderson with Asora Education here in Massachusetts. I'm interested in the role of remediation. I know that anecdotally there are some private schools that continuously remediate students to keep them at grade level. Has that been tried in the public systems, and what is the experience about that? How would that affect these results?
John or Michael? You want to?
Michael. Well, it's a crucial issue. So the best systems in the world, Andreas can confirm or add or refine to this. First of all, in large numbers of countries, particularly in the Pacific Asian countries, they don't share the talent myth that that is prevalent in the UK and the US. So we think people are born smart or not born smart, and then we expect the school system to kind of sort them out. They don't share that view. They think that hard work, effort, and so on will be rewarded. It's an absolutely fundamental part of it. So they expect every child to succeed. That is fundamental, and that's in the society as well as the schools. So the second thing is, once the children are then making progress through the school, if somebody falls behind, they do something about it. They do it early, and they do it well. They don't put them off into different tracks. They don't sort them out into kind of remediation classes that happen after school and are pretty low level and not given any status. They address it early, they have the data to do that, and they pick them up because they don't believe the myth and they have the system to avoid it. So it is absolutely fundamental, and it's not just in Pacific Asia. Finland is expert at this, I think, as well. And that's something that, to put it crudely, the Anglo-Saxon societies need to rethink, because we all believe in the talent myth. If you look at the recent data on achievement in sport and chess and all of these other things, 10,000 hours of deliberate practice can make you an expert. It can't make you Tiger Woods, but it can make you a great golfer. But in our heads, we think people are either born brilliant at chess or born brilliant at math. The number of people who go around saying, I'm not very good at math, is very, very common in Anglo-Saxon societies. You've got to get rid of the talent myth in the society, and then you've got to put the systems in the school to address it.
It's very interesting, actually, Michael. The recent Pew Global Attitude Survey asked one of the regular questions is, will hard work lead to success in life? Do you need to, will it guarantee success? And all of the European social democracies don't believe that, right? They all believe it's accidents of birth or other things. The two countries that are highest on that are actually the U.S. and China, which are both very high leaders on it. I just suspect that the U.S. has a very different opinion of what hard work means relative to the Chinese in terms of how many hours are involved on this. John, I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in on.
No, I think my one-sentence response is that there are some of the highest achieving schools in the U.S. are in fact adopting the practices that Michael was describing. That's true. But there are too few.
No, just on this talent issue, actually, we have done surveys on that at the level of students, and you do in fact find that students in the United States often attribute success to sort of, I'm born lucky to do well in mathematics, and if I'm not, I'm studying something else. 9 out of 10 Asians, and that holds for almost all East Asian countries, say that the route to success actually has to do with their own effort, which reveals you a lot about the system. Basically, it's a system on which they basically believe, that system helps me to support. But I wanted to come back on this issue and remediation. The concept of remediation really reveals a very industrial conception of education. We grind everybody through a same machine, and then some people come out not as we expected, and we try to fix that then. What you actually see in many high-performing systems is the combination of constant diagnosis and intervention. Sort of that there is a very ongoing process of basically finding out where are the strengths and weaknesses of students and immediate intervention. Again, the most extreme in the Nordic countries, you have between 20 and 30% of instruction time delivered in schools for basically outside the formal classroom setting, to precisely do those kind of things. It's not stigmatizing students. It's basically, and every student in those systems becomes a special student at one point or a time, not because they are attributed some characteristic.
Just do you agree that while you're praising the Nordic countries, I was struck by the fact that Sweden was the biggest loser on RIC's results.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's an accurate assessment of what's been happening in Sweden over the last 20 years, or
Actually, it's actually quite more recent phenomenon. Sweden has done a lot of progress. It's in the last 5-6 years that it has lost enormously in performance. And what has happened in Sweden is that while in the past all students had a similar achievement level, the achievement gap between schools has dramatically widened. And it's basically, the short story of this is that they have opened up school autonomy without having any kind of system around that. Basically, they have allowed sort of anybody to open a school without having any form of monitoring intervention. And basically what you see is the high-performing schools have not become any better, but a lot of schools have dramatically declined. If you think about between PISA 2003 and PISA 2006, they doubled the between-school variability in performance and lowered performance. So it's a quite recent trend, which you can tie quite closely to what has happened in the system.
fascinating?
Yeah, just on that, I'm actually wearing the tie of the Swedish presidency of the European Union. I just noticed, but they are really worried as well about recruiting, continuing to recruit really good people into teaching for the future. That's a big concern of the education minister. That just reinforces Andreas's point.
You've been very patient in backlining that. Let me just
Sure. Hi, Becky Strauss from the Council on Foreign Relations. It was my understanding that in the U.S., actually, the best determinant of student achievement is parental educational attainment and also socioeconomic status. So really what matters is everything outside of the school, and probably less so internationally, but maybe you can talk about that. But my question is then, are there states that have shown that link is weakening? So there are states that are overperforming given their current human capital levels or socioeconomic situation.
I think the answer is yes. We know that parents are really important. There's just no doubt about it. They have, kids spend a lot more time with parents in the best of environments, sometimes less time with parents or out of school than they do in school. But we also know from the evidence on the power of good teachers that it can be overcome. The estimates that Steve Rivkin and I have done suggest that somewhere between 3 and 5 years with a sort of good teacher compared to an average teacher can erase the average deficit that comes with being poor. So that it is possible. What we don't have is a system that systematically ensures that poor kids get 3 to 5 years of a good teacher. They, in fact, tend to get the average teacher. They get a good teacher 1 year and a poor teacher the other. And you can look at graphs from NAEP across the states, and you see that some of the school systems are doing much better than you would expect just based upon parental income or parental education.
So there's been a change towards improvement that's not linked towards.
Yeah, no, that's what John mentioned of some of the best charter schools are serving the really low-income, exclusively low-income populations, and are suddenly finding that they're the top schools in an area. You can point to a few schools in California, and you can point to the Harlem Children's Zone and so forth, where there are schools that have demonstrated that family background is not deterministic of the future, or doesn't have to be, but the majority of our schools don't ensure that they have the continuous inputs of the high-quality teachers and high-quality education to overcome these backgrounds, so the backgrounds are maintained.
Are there states or school systems that have also seen this?
John wanted to get in on.
Do you want to answer that specific question, Andreas? Or not?
Yeah.
Well, let me. Okay, so the answer is yes, and we can talk about examples of states and districts and schools that have all, as some of the states alluded to, dramatically closed the gap between low-income kids and other kids, particularly at the school level and some district level, and closed the variation among similar school systems. What I would say is this is one of these most dangerous issues, I think, that can impede our progress in American education. The fact that the correlation has been significantly high, there's often been generally, if you have more, higher poverty you are, on average, lower achieving. The fact has been confused, which wasn't your point, but it's been confused in this country to understand that ultimately, if you came from a family with a good education, well, you're going to succeed, and if you don't, you're not. And the data that's been shown here totally destroys it. Now, then I think there have been efforts to say we can do much better that have been sometimes miscommunicated, misinterpreted, saying, wow, you think this is easy and poverty doesn't matter. Of course poverty matters. In fact, that's why we need that much more intensive focus and higher expectations and resources actually to help kids who are further behind, so you can do the things that high-achieving low-income schools, most of them actually have more time that they can have, which costs money for kids that used well, and having the extra people to be able to identify and diagnose where kids are off and how to intervene. So there's a need that underscores that you have to have greater intensity and resources. And the U.S. does terribly, I think, by global comparisons in terms of our resources for low-income schools compared to higher income. The other thing that I think that the other huge risk in that is that I think that very myth that ultimately poverty or wealth will drive success also is at the root of our complacency as a country about where we are in middle-class America, because then we think, that's someone else's, often in middle-class America, which drives a lot of the politics. That's the problem over, that's too bad, and if I'm charitable, I want to help. But people aren't realizing that, and studies here, and Eric's research shows this, the U.S. ranks 30th in the world in terms of the percentage of our kids who are achieving at advanced levels. My reading of the PISA data is we rank 23rd in the world in terms of how kids in our top quartile income families are doing. So our high achievers, our higher income kids, our middle-class kids are behind, and the fact that you described them, you probably asked for this reason, misunderstood, both keeps low achieving and high poverty kids down, and it keeps middle class and higher achieving kids down too.
Okay, we've got 5 more minutes, and what I want to do is I want to allow 2 people who've had their hands up to ask questions, and I'm going to give you each person a minute to either answer those questions or say whatever concluding remarks they want to say. So Terry, I saw you had your hand up earlier.
It sounded like Michael, Andreas, and John had a similar recipe, which is very exciting because you come from a very different backgrounds and direction. But I don't think the typical leader at a school, either a parent leader, community leader, or principal, has that recipe. So how do you go from, our test scores are terrible, to what can you do about it? I think that's the dilemma. That doesn't get in the news because that's hard work and it's complicated. How do you help make it more common knowledge, the sets of variables that you think make a difference?
Great. And for the last question, please.
Jeff Purrier from the Partnership for Education Reform in Latin America. I'm struck in this discussion about what works and what doesn't work. I'm struck by the fact that no one has used the words teachers union. It hasn't been mentioned. And in Latin America, the first thing a minister of education worries about, or a president who wants to improve education, is how do we deal with the teachers unions. My question is, how much variability is there from country to country, Finland, let's say, compared to Germany or what have you, in the behavior of teachers unions and the way they're regulated? And secondly, does it make a difference?
Rick, the floor is yours for a minute.
First, to Terry's question, some work that Steve Rivkin and I have recently been doing leads me to believe that school leadership has been underassessed or undervalued, and that we have to pay a lot more attention to selecting good leaders and getting rid of bad leaders, just in the same way as teachers. And I'll say one short comment on unions. I think that the teachers' unions in the U.S. have made a huge mistake by their policies that you cannot differentiate among teachers, and that has led, among other things, to keeping salaries down for teachers because nobody wants to pay the turkey as much as the eagle, and that it's in the union's interest to get on board with a better evaluation and career program for teachers, and that's going to be an essential part of U.S. reform.
On the question you just asked, about a year ago I spent an hour and a half with the teacher union leaders in Colombia at the request of the education minister there, and it was a very sobering experience. And the argument I made to them is, you could, if you imagine one of your members retiring in 2032, they could either say, we had a terrible time, nothing really changed, we were at war with the government the whole time, we were paid badly, and everything was terrible, or they could retire in 2032 and say, we were there when Colombia's education system was transformed. But it was, to be honest, like talking to a brick wall. And so yes, of course it makes a difference. Teacher unions are present in most countries, and a lot depends on the leadership of the system, the minister, the top officials, and the response of the unions and the way the unions think. And there are many variable responses. Teacher unions are going to be there, so systems have to think through how to get that relationship to work. But as Rick says, many of the policies of unions in many countries, particularly, for example, a focus on regulated class size, have been destructive and wasting resources, actually to the detriment of their own members in many cases. There are other examples. Michael could talk about Ontario possibly later, where they've managed to do a series of deals over a 10-year period that have, on the whole, made that work. I just had 3 concluding remarks very quickly. I want to go back and reinforce Rick's point right at the beginning of this dialogue. Complacency kills. In the team I work with, we've banned the word comfortable. Restless self-evaluation is absolutely fundamental. I really agree with Rick's point about unique leadership with the courage to shake systems up, and there are a variety of ways of doing that, but you've got to shake the system up. And finally, I just want to pick up the colleague from the CFR. I don't think you intended this, but that you used the word overperformance. In the modern world, given the challenges ahead, even in Singapore, there's no such thing as overperformance. Even the best systems in the world are wasting talent on a colossal basis. And if we're going to meet the challenges of the 21st century, we can't even begin to talk about overperformance yet.
My observation on unions is that every system gets the unions it deserves. And let me explain that. If you have an industrial work organization in education, you get industrial unions, and they want to try to standardize labor, and they try to fight against differentiation, and they fight for salaries and working hours and so on. If you offer a professional work organization, teachers are and unions are in a very different role, and they have to actually fight for professional standards. They have to fight for the kind. You can actually observe that in some of the countries where unions were radical in the past. They support and actually performance-related pay systems. You know, there are countries in the OECD where unions play a big role, and they were initially against it, but now they're great supporters of it because the membership demands it. I think really it has to do with how you organize education, the nature of the unions, and the nature of the relationship between government and unions is very much a reflection of the way this is organized. One comment on parental education. It's quite true. Parental education matters everywhere. By the way, this puts the US at a big advantage compared to most other industrialized nations because you have the highest level of parental education in the education. But I think the question is, can you do something about it? And there are 2 things. One is the relationship between parental education and occupation varies a lot across countries, which tells you that sort of this differences can be overcome. And it has also changed amazingly over time. If you look at Poland, if you look at Germany, if you look at Singapore, these are countries where parental education made a huge difference in the past and makes a lot less of a difference today, which tells you that you actually can overcome that kind of social economic disadvantage.
So 3 final comments. One, to Terry's question, I think that as Rick was describing from a research perspective, I think that on the ground superintendents are, as they're trying to raise the bar and move through a lot of the reforms, I think are coming to the fact that they cannot do this without a much better leadership strategy. How do they select and develop and support and remove principals, school leadership teams, and there have been some bright spots at a programmatic level. I think New Leaders for New Schools is one of those. But the question of how we scale that now, I think, is a central question that's not getting paid enough attention to, but I think that there's a real opportunity and need for that. Secondly, on the teacher union question, I think that we've got a big organizational change effort here. We're in the U.S. where we're going from kind of a complacency and a modestly incrementally better performance level at the lower grades and no real improvements at the higher grades, and to move forward. And with often low levels of capacity at the teacher and school level in terms of understanding what's needed, because we haven't as a system delivered on that. And I think that's a challenging situation to make change with teachers' unions. I think that there are some places where the teacher capacity is very high, where there have been some great examples of teacher union school system collaboration in the U.S. Montgomery County is a great example where the teacher union and the school system has played a role. Much easier, I think Andreas' point, when you've got a professional work model, high authority and capacity, it's easier where there's that capacity in the first place than I think for the unions to get on board. When you're going to a place where there's much lower capacity, you have to do things, as you say, you can mandate sort of incremental improvement, unleash greatness. When you're in that first phase, that change effort, I think, depends on very sophisticated leadership at the school system level and the union level. And I think there are only a small number of places in the country where we've been lucky enough to have both at the same time. I actually think one of the places that I'm think is very promising in the U.S. at the city level right now is New Haven. Seeing what's happening in New Haven, both at the school system level and the union level. It's not perfect, but I think that has got some promise. But I think that's sort of the tension. And so I think there has to be real change in teacher unions, but it's also got to change in the systems, and it's an organizational change effort that's hard when you've got low level capacity. The very last thing I'd say is just that I think the public and the educator engagement in trying to solve this problem is so key. And I do think that one thing that gets lost, although people in this room know it well, is that the massive shift we've gone through in this economy. The fact that 25% of U.S. jobs required post-secondary education in 1973, 2 in 3 jobs today. The wage gap between people with a high school degree and some post-secondary degree is now 80-90%. Not just 4-year degrees, obviously 2-year degrees. Certificate training programs often play a big role. And I think people, and including educators, often are just not zeroed in on what does that higher bar mean? What really is the expectation and the practice for student work and for teacher practice that they can work on? And then, for your point, Terry, you have to figure out what to do about it. But I don't think people don't even realize, think, well, you know what, this kind of was good enough before, and it's probably good enough now, as opposed to realizing what that higher bar looks like and what they have to shoot for.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I hope you join me in thanking our four panel members for really a superb session. Thank you very much. And I guess lunch is served. Yeah.
Good. How are you, Mike?
Well.
I'm fine. Are you around for a while today?
I'm around for a while. I'm going to see Tom Payne at lunchtime out here, and I'm coming back, and I'm leaving 4 o'clock.
Yeah, I'm here about 2 or so.